30 years ago, huge historical events reshaped Europe, bringing back democracy and freedom to many countries of Central and Eastern Europe. It is my pleasure and honor to have a conversation about those events and the processes that were launched by them with Renata Mien, Norkiene, a Polish politologist and sociologist, associate professor at the University of Warsaw. Hello, nice to see you and nice to have you.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for agreeing. The first question would be quite general. Looking back to those events of 1989, 90, 91 in your country and in Europe generally, what do you see as the most important?
Well, I think that the most important thing would be coming back to where we belong, which means coming back to Europe, where we were taken from, actually, after the World War II. And after, let's say, agreements, we didn't particularly have much influence on. So speaking about that, I would say that the most important feeling also of those who both participated in it as the let's say, directly involved activists and who supported it. I mean, the Polish society and societies of all those countries that gained independence from 1999 to 1991 in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. Those they definitely supported changes. Of course, a different story is what the motivation of those people was, what they had expected actually, but that's a different story. But in any case, I think that everyone is sort of relieved speaking about those changes and gaining independence. First of all, due to the fact that it meant coming back to Europe and getting any chance on integration with the European Union, getting, let's say, security guarantee from NATO rather than the Soviet Union, which was, I would say, expected as something much more reliable and credible as well and legitimate. So from that point of view, I think this was the most important thing. But also, it's not a big secret that probably the expectations were also economic. So not only political, not only social in a sense, you know, of a civilizational, I would say, but also economic. The situation was really tough at the end of the 80s. And, you know, there were really shortages everywhere. So from that point of view, I would say that also people expected a huge shift economically and, of course, a progress that they probably hadn't expected anything particular. So they hadn't had any chosen way that they would support or not. But they definitely expected something that would bring back the economic prosperity and progress. And this is actually what happened, but a different story is what victims it also sort of brought on our way to the European Union, to NATO, but that's a different story. So I would put it this way.
When we're talking about coming back to Europe, of course, the first thought is that this is the process of joining European Union, and there were a lot of expectations from the old countries of Europe and from the side of newborn members, and of course there were some package of values that actually united all of those. Please comment those expectations from both sides. Are they fulfilled now in the year 2021? And those joint values of free market and liberal freedoms and so on, are they still connecting so-called old and new Europe together?
Wow, that's a very tough question, actually, although it's a good one. You see, well, it's been 30, more actually than 30 years. In some states like Lithuania or Estonia, it's 30 exactly. Yes, I would say that to a large extent, those expectations, they have been fulfilled, probably gradually, and of course, not all at once brought, let's say, satisfaction to all possible stakeholders that had expected, let's say, progress and shift towards Europe, and what was identified with prosperity and welfare. That's one thing. Another thing is that, of course, those changes, they are not, I would say, profitable at the same way to all of those stakeholders groups. And we might say that those who were more active, who, let's say, understood better the free market and liberal market rules, they might be satisfied, and I think that they gained a lot. While those who lived a little bit delusionally, with all those ideals of something that will just fly from the sky, and immediately change everything into a prosperity, let's say, area, they or those who believed in some ideals of solidarity, in a sense that solidarity would have brought, let's say, a sort of sharing everywhere in communitarian way. They might be disappointed also today. But plus, of course, there were victims which were supposed to be victims, like those who lived in all those former kolkhoz, or those who lived in former big, let's say, farms that were created artificially in the Soviet Union. Those changes there. So change, shifts in ownership, giving those people, let's say, pieces of lands with responsibilities to somehow take care for them, might have been a better solution. But it didn't happen. So what happened was just freeing it and putting it on the market, which also brought a lot of speculation and so on. Those who worked there and then became unemployed, they obviously lost. And then some of them, they found their way in free market economy, the others didn't. So yes, here we have this, let's say, problem. Another thing are elites from that time, and solidarity elites, and those who actually intellectually contributed to all those changes. They did, I would say, contribute morally, but they probably lost politically, in particular recently. Why? There are a few reasons. In such countries as Poland or Hungary, elites changed, and now such people as Orban or Kaczynski, they put all these things, I would say, they draw a picture of history, I would say, the other way around. So they diminish, they destroy them, let's say, those pictures of heroes from solidarity times, from those times of changes, just because of political reasons, because it's for them it's simply politically profitable. So they also destroy the whole, I would say, the whole story around gaining independence as something really good, something that brought us to Europe back. Furthermore, they actually introduce a lot of solutions, both economically and in the sphere of values, that that actually well, as similar as in the Soviet Union. I'm sorry to say that, but in Poland we have these narratives that there should be this solidarity of ordinary people against elites. It's this us and them narrative. Similar stories in Hungary, and some political powers in also other countries like the Baltic states, or sometimes in Slovakia, in Czech Republic, there are these narratives. They basically also use these arguments that there are them, which are those elites that do not understand ordinary people, and us, some ordinary people, let's say, that we as politicians represent. So you see, the whole narrative has been reversed. The one of a success of independence, let's say 1989, 1990, 1991, and these political, let's say, I would say, people like Orban and Kaczynski, I'm trying to populists. I would say those populists that use narrative to draw a totally different, sometimes the opposite picture of what has happened for these 30 years. They have also brought, I would say, a kind of a resentment to those groups that obviously gained regarding those 30 years. Like farmers, for example, also because of the European Union's membership. That's quite obvious. Farmers, they gained a lot. While nowadays elites, let's say, but elites in a sense, political elites, or those who rule Poland or Hungary, they try to put to heads of these people, let's say, this picture of the EU as still being a threat and not a good source, let's say, of redistribution, and also social solidarity to some extent. So all this picture of solidarity, of social justice, it has been reversed by some politicians, in particular populist politicians. And this is something that I would say also changed the real picture of what has happened for these 30 years, and who really gained and who really lost. Apart from those that really lost their jobs and immediately lost due to all those changes in those farms, big farms, or in cities or towns where there was really huge unemployment. And of course, there was also inflation and so on and so forth. Speaking about that, I would say that these were the real victims. But there were not, I would say, masses. Plus, there were efforts to somehow support them, to help them lean into the liberal market economy. But at the same time, my parents are an example of let's say, such people. But at the same time, there are those who gained. But nowadays, politicians like Orban or Kaczynski, they try to state that they haven't gained actually, and they sort of change the history, and they also use ressentiments towards Germans, towards the European Union and Europeans as such. They try to let's say they try to fight with solidarity as this wonderful value that brought us to the European Union, and they use it as let's say, this argument against those who really fought at that time, 1989, 1991. So like Wałęsa, for example, he used to be a symbol, but Kaczynski, he did all he could, I think, to make Wałęsa simply a person that is now evaluated by a huge part of the society negatively. This wasn't the case, before Kaczynski started his narrative. But people, for different reasons, they sometimes just give up. Sometimes speaking about their own way of evaluating things, and they just follow certain narratives. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that would be the picture. I would say that. Now, young people also changed a little bit the picture of heroes from that time, because I can tell you about what happened in Poland recently, and unexpectedly, how some heroes fell down from the solidarity time, from those times of 1989, 1991. These are men who really fought in solidarity and who really contributed to gaining independence, but they are a little bit discriminatory regarding women. And now, when there was a big, let's say, protest wave in Poland, women's strike, due to, as you probably know, the decision ruling of the Constitutional Court in Poland, that put nearly total ban on abortion, then those men who have these wonderful, achievements from solidarity time, from those changes times, they were like, oh, women, they shout too loudly, they use, not nice words, they should maybe rather stay at home, in the kitchen and so on. Actually, this is their place. And their myth fell down immediately. So young women actually also destroyed certain myths a little bit coincidentally, just because there was a specific, let's say, opportunity for that. And some masks, they also fell from the faces. So speaking of that, there are also these unexpected and a little bit I would say weird aspects of evaluating of those 30 years. Yes, young women now, they evaluate those people not as heroes, but as people who hadn't, who maybe had their, let's say, moments of let's say, success and influence, but now they should rather stay in a shadow of what politics should be about and what should be decided upon in today's Poland society. So, but that's Poland, of course. But I would say that every state of those post-Soviet states has its own specificity and probably also its own myths falling down.
Well, that is just fascinating overview. Thank you very much for this. And the next question will be connected with this analysis. If we're talking about so-called new conservative movements which are opposing European Union structures and bringing back old narratives of social life and traditional understanding of life, then this trend is much more than Central and Eastern Europe. We see actually quite similar stuff going on elsewhere. Also, for example, in Germany, in France, we see quite the same things. Just a picture, those people who actually tear down the Berlin Wall being Germans in 1989 and 90 and so on, many of those people started to vote for parties who actually are building new walls. Luckily, not physical, but in the beginning, it's always a psychological wall, and then the physical wall follows. So there was a huge switch in those groups of the society who actually contributed and risked their even lives for more open and more free Europe. So if you take into account this global European trend, what do you see inside the trend? Why this switch happened about like 10 or 5 or something like that years ago?
Now, again, a very tough question, If I had a ready, I would say, answer, I would probably advise, the biggest now on the European political scene. But there might be a few explanations. So, first of all, Karl Popper already said that, and actually his predecessors, that open society is its own biggest enemy. So those who are really liberal and, who really believe in openness and freedom, sometimes they forget that it may happen that some of those who use the freedom, they will use it to limit it. And this is what has actually happened in many cases, actually, in European politics. Another thing is that we forget that the Western Europe, because you also asked about whether Western Europeans, let's say, gained from what happened and from the European integration of those Central and Eastern European states. Of course, they got, I don't know, a big market for their products and, a lot of cheap labor power, that labor force that was also quite useful. Now Germany is, for example, really quite successful in adopting this big labor force from this wave of immigration and from the wave of refugees also from the Middle East, although it's not widely, let's say, discussed in the same way. But basically, there is a lot of data confirming that this is the case. That Germany actually gained from that and profited from that, or has been profiting from that. But why actually those let's say movements appeared that question now the whole idea of freedom and of let's say openness? Well, because we have the social media, because we have a new wave of youngsters who do not remember what happened 30 years ago. So they forgot the whole effort, the whole let's say devotion that was the case 30 years ago. And they now think in a bit different way. So they listen to what their parents say. Some of their parents are disappointed. They listen to the politicians. And, youngsters, they usually, when they enter this, let's say, political market, their first political choices are extremely exotic and usually very radical. So young men all over Europe, actually, their first political choice is some radical AfD, or in Poland, Konfederacja, or whatever. This is their first choice. And then, if they establish their families, if they take, let's say, loan and have a mortgage, then obviously they change their political choices. But if they don't, and this is what happens a lot, that family is not valued anymore, that young men, that they don't want to establish families, plus sometimes they don't have possibilities to do that, in a sense that they prefer, video games, or they prefer, let's say, staying with their parents, or they prefer just being alone and, not binding relationships. They also sometimes get attracted to leaders that are quite radical, but that promise things which will never be fulfilled. But they don't know it because they have never experienced anything that would, let's say, make them get rid of those illusions. So speaking about that, I would say that young men are the ones to be blamed for that first. I know it's not politically correct what I say, but simply the data confirm that. It's not my idea. Young women, sometimes they also support those exotic radical right, let's say, parties, or radical left. But more commonly, young women, they go towards, let's say, environmental protection. So they would rather support radical left than radical right, at least in Central and Eastern Europe. But also I can see that in the West. Maybe in the West it's all a little bit milder. It's not that, let's say, radical. But at the same time, this is the case. Plus, what happened with those political parties that were established in this spirit of openness and so on, whether on the left side of the political scene or on the right side of political scene. And it refers both to, let's say, CDU and SPD, as well as to the Polish Civic Platform, or SLD, so those left, let's say, oriented parties, or to French, let's say, Social Democrats and French, let's say, more central parties. They got so broad speaking about their program that actually, and at the same time, they got a little bit old-fashioned, in a sense that they are not that attractive anymore with the same faces all the time and so on, that people do not feel they represent them anymore. And it's both youngsters who see the same old faces and those who expect maybe a little bit more merit inside of those parties' programs, but the merit is basically the same. So it's the same words, the same old passwords, while conditions are very different. And another reason which I would point out is also the fact that the internet, it brings much more space to those who use fake news, who use trolls, bots, and this is obviously not what CDU does, or all those old and nice and honest political parties. This is what radical parties that have not much to lose and that basically attract youngsters, this is what they do. So youngsters are, let's say, fed with fake news, with what bots produce, with trolling, trolls that really they pretend to produce some real content. This is all also contributing to wins of such people as Donald Trump, but at the same time, such people as Confederation in Poland, or even Kaczynski, because you would get really surprised how Kaczynski's party, so Law and Justice, how well it actually uses the internet. They invest a lot of people in that, a lot of effort, a lot of money, and believe me, they are really good at using the internet. And there is a lot of research done on that. I don't know, recently Robert Gorwa from Oxford, he researched the Polish political internet, and 1/3 of it is totally full of fake news bots and trolls, and it comes basically either from the Kremlin, mainly, or from Law and Justice, or from Confederation, so those radical right sides of the Polish political scene. So you can imagine how it works. And to put all that together, plus people's readiness for populists, because people who see that all those changes, they didn't bring something that is steady, that we have new, let's say, threats like environmental, let's say, degradation, or problems with solidarity, and in particular with social justice. We can see that those who are rich, they become richer no matter the crisis. And, it's mainly American big companies, big tech companies, and so on. And they have enormous money, while regular people, let's say, who just work every day, and they work hard and they work honestly, they have exactly as much as they did, or even less because of the inflation. Then, there is this relative deprivation sense, plus there is this sense of total social injustice. And this obviously brings a lot more, let's say, field for populists who come with the ready answers. Oh, we will sort it out. And it doesn't matter what will happen on our way to do that, but this is what they promise. Mm-hmm. This is also what Kaczynski does. So he says, I will equalize those inequalities that appeared after 1989. And obviously, people shouldn't believe it, but they do, because, they just expect someone to tell them that there were inequalities. There have been problems with those reforms, post-Soviet reforms. And Kaczynski comes there and he says, yes, I know it was also, for many of you, it wasn't a time of prosperity and success. And these people, for some reason, also forget that their children, they are already used to the European Union, to, all those freedoms and so on. And sometimes they even sort of forget about their children, or even devote their children's, let's say, wealth and a sort of freedom just to satisfy those resentimental, let's say, feelings. I can give you an example. During the pandemic, some of my students, they had to stay in their family houses, somewhere in the mountains and so on in the province. And although these students, they are LGBT representatives, they have same sex friends, or even people they live with. They went to their parents, and they were, despite their age, 22, 23, they were made by their parents to go to church, to stay away from such friends and so on. It's a totally different world. But that world is fed by Kaczynski. The new world is fed by fake news, or makes these people just simply feel totally out of politics. That's also another trend that we can see, that youngsters, they stay away from politics because they don't see any parties representing them. So there is this post-representativeness phenomenon. And young people, they do not see any party that would represent their real lifestyles, the way they perceive the world, the way they want those threats to be somehow challenged. And this is also one of the reasons why youngsters stay away from politics and they do not go to vote. So whose vote then is more important? Well, their parents, because it's there. It's put, the ballot is put there, while the youngster is not. So that's also one of the reasons why I would say the situation looks the way it does.
If you project these trends that you perfectly describe on the functioning of the European Union, what would you see from that point of view? European Union is sometimes viewed as the source of problems, or not functioning organization, or the organization that is taking away and not giving. All sorts of the sentiments are represented, and even many extremely reliable experts are saying that through the history of European Union there was never a period like this when the most important political and also ideological basis of the union are shaking. So how do you see these problematics?
Well, thank you for this question, because you see, as a European scientist, because I'm also identifying myself with this name, I can see that, yes, there has been more and more, let's say, narrative around the EU as something that hasn't been functioning properly for a few years already. And probably in the West, some scientists would say, oh, it's due to this enlargement 2004. Again, referring to what you said about who gained, who lost, and so on. But at the same time, the United States, they used to be separate states, and at some point they united, and what we have now is a totally different, let's say, entity than it used to be in the 18th century, right? So we mustn't forget that the progress faces everyone, and also political entities like the European Union. Progress in the sense that there is simply the surrounding that changes, and that's obvious. We have globalization and so on and so forth. At the same time, we have been facing the crisis just because we have been also facing what I've just described as, the rise of populism and so on. And the EU is actually quite slow in responding to those threats that are fast as such. Because, to put a fake news on the internet, it takes a few seconds. When you are the European Union, to fight with it, legally, credibly, it takes months or years. That's the bare truth. So, of course, the EU does its best to fight fake news, to launch, let's say, procedures that would lead to adoption of new regulations and so on. It is already called the biggest regulatory power in the world, actually. There is a great book of Anu Bradford about the EU, the Brussels effect, how the European Union rules the world. But this is obviously not the full truth. The full truth is also that the states, they can see that to face those biggest challenges of the modernity, you cannot be just a state. You have to do that in cooperation with other states. And, bilateral cooperation is not sufficient anymore. So you have to do it on, let's say, on this platform of international organizations. And the EU is one of them, simply. And, to face those challenges like, let's say, environmental protection necessity and so on, this is obviously needed on the level of the European Union. On the other hand, those populists, they use the EU, on the one hand, as a great source of money, because where else would they get this money from? On the other hand, they obviously blame the EU for everything that is wrong, and they, let's say, use the narrative that it's them who contributed the most to what actually the EU has done well. So it's a great opportunity for any populist, just to pretend that they were the ones who did a good job if it was the EU, and to put the blame on the EU whenever something goes wrong, okay, or not the way they promised. So this has been going on in Hungary, in Poland, but also in many other EU member states. But that's not everything, of course. We also have these problems, let's say, with young people who consider the EU, the air, actually. It's just there, we use it, and there is no way it can be taken away from us, which is wrong. Because as I've already told you, even their parents can take it away from them. What they do not notice or are not noticing sometimes, just because it's the way politics goes, right? A little bit, it goes unnoticed what has been going on, but at the end it may lead to, let's say, even a shift from democracy, like it's well described by Ziblatt and Levitsky in How Democracies Die. So a very famous book. So if you take Poland or Hungary as an example, you can see all the steps, step by step, described in this book. So How Democracies Die, and this is what has been going on. The EU is also, due to, let's say, all those values enlisted in Article 2 and some mechanisms that might prevent or protect the rule of law, going away from, or protecting the rule of law and democracy, they have some instruments, but they are not sufficient, because also the scale of what has happened in such countries as Poland or Hungary, it is also, let's say, a little bit, it exceeded anyone's expectations, I think. Sorry.
That's okay.
And at the same time, sorry for that. And at the same time, these mechanisms also function when the atmosphere is democratic. But when someone just comes and and says, "I don't play this game," okay, I do, but I'll just take the money, but I will not contribute to all this value stuff, and they convince their citizens and so on about that. This becomes already dangerous. But what the EU cannot do, it cannot divide or separate the societies from their governments. The societies are pro-European, and this is what the EU considers important. And that's why it would rather wait until governments change. And this is what has been going on, actually. I think that the EU's response to all those populist, parties' threats in countries like Hungary or Poland, that's why the EU doesn't intervene that much, because it knows quite well that if it does, the societies might react in an anti-European way. While if they wait, maybe the next elections will bring, will bring a change, okay, and coming back to Europe. Of course, it can be naive, and it is if we take the case of Hungary. It might also be if we take the case of Poland. But at the same time, I mean, maybe if the real crisis comes, then the EU will intervene with the full, let's say, power and full obligations to it. At the same time, what has just happened after the pandemic, namely the Next Generation EU multi-annual financial framework, where all of the EU member states contribute, both in, taking the loan and in redistributing the money, the Hamilton, let's say, like moment. This can be something that will economically involve those states to the extent which will prevent any government from, let's say, those anti-European movements. But, this can be, as I said, this can be naive. It also produces an effect that the EU hasn't probably expected, namely young people who do believe in the European Union, or who did believe in that. They start considering it so helpless that they start being anti-European, not because they do not believe in the EU in a sense that it's not good. They think it's great. It's just that it's helpless, speaking about, going away from democracy in such countries as Poland or Hungary. And therefore, they start believing that it's just, it just doesn't have enough power and enough competences. And they become a little bit, maybe not reluctant, but indifferent towards the EU. That's also not good, because you don't want these types of attitudes when you believe that the EU can somehow intervene in those situations when there is really breaking of those main values. So, it's really not so easy to describe what has been going on, even not to speak about giving, some ready solutions. But what the EU might do, it could actually use its legal powers like the Court of Justice of the European Union, which it actually does. Okay, also carefully, but still, it does both towards the new European member states. I mean, those which joined the EU after 2000 or in 2004 and later, but also towards the old ones, which it also does, like Germany, for example, to discipline those states and to remind them of belonging to the common sphere of values like the EU. Because we all know that the Constitutional Tribunal in Karlsruhe also sometimes, let's say, makes these steps that underline how member states are important while the EU, exceeds its competences. We shouldn't, and if we see that the European Commission has just sued Germany in front of the Court of Justice, we can see that it also sort of protects this sense, this feeling of the Europeans that everyone is treated exactly the same way, whether it's Germany or it's Hungary or Poland. So, to a large extent, the EU does what it can. But at the same time, let's not forget about the human factor, okay, which is Ursula von der Leyen. She has, let's say, a limited worldview, just because she meets certain people, she doesn't meet the others. A similar story with Jourova. Jourova comes from a specific surroundings. She has a little bit more, let's say, clear picture of what might happen in Central and Eastern Europe, but it does not mean that she immediately convinces everyone else about that. Plus, she has her own, attitudes and her own interests and so on. And of course, she also has her own instruments, which are not unlimited. So if you put all that, on the table, then you understand that the EU might not actually act more. What is very optimistic, and this is about trends, is what Eurobarometer shows, that the European Union's citizens everywhere in the EU, in all member states, they trust the EU more than their own governments, which is particularly visible in Central and Eastern Europe. They believe that the EU will help them get out of the crisis. And they also, and this is quite understandable, and they also believe in those measures that the EU has, which actually brings a lot of optimism. Plus, if you also take into consideration that in Poland, for example, the religiousness of youngsters and of the elderly, the discrepancy in religiousness is the biggest in the world, then you can see that the new generation will not listen to what Catholic Church says. It will not listen to, all those who use Catholic Church as a source of values, which means they will probably take these values from Article 2 of the treaty. And one more thing that you actually I forgot to say, but it's related to those changes of 1989, in particular in Poland. But it's a little bit similar probably in other member states, although not in all of them. In some of them, the church collaborated with the communists. But in Poland, church supported Solidarity and those who opposed the Communist Party, which means that Catholic Church for a long time was a holy cow and no one could touch it. So it influenced political, let's say, choices of the Polish society and of the political elites as well. Now it will probably change because it's not a holy cow anymore. Plus all those pedophiles, let's say, pedophile scandals and so on, they will put a totally different light on, have already put a totally different light on the Catholic Church. And this will probably lead to a deepening, let's say, of belief in other sources of values, not the ones from Catholic Church. And it's Catholic Church that now represents this closeness of, perception that is against refugees, that is maintaining women in kitchen and in giving birth to children and so on and so forth. So this brings chance. How much time it will take to change people's attitudes and get rid of populists, at least to the extent in which they do not have a real influence on the power, difficult to say, but I would give it a decade or maybe 15 years, something like that, and then it should work. In particular, in these in the face of those threats, like environmental, let's say, degradation, and also a shift in energy, let's say, availability, because this is also something that is very important, since Russia really used energy as this incredible source of influence everywhere. And now we have a very different energy paradigm in the European Union, despite Nord Stream 2 and so on. Let's leave it aside because this is more political and more German, Russian, rather than European. But at the same time, when we have all these shifts, they also may lead, let's say, to changes in people's mentality and perceptions. Although Russia is trying to regain, let's say, its influence through the internet and through fake news and trolling and so on, but maybe also the European Union will manage to somehow I don't know, deal with that problem as well, and maybe somehow put all these internet things into certain order, legal order, that will protect the citizens mainly and the consumers first.
Since we're running slowly out of time, my last question will be not about analysis, but about hope and about the perception of future. Do you believe that those children who are now at the moment in kindergartens or elementary schools, do you believe that they will,
like my kid,
like your kid, that they will be in their life richer, safer, healthier than you are at the moment in Europe?
You see the trend. Yeah, the trend is unfortunately not very much in favor of our kids. Because me, myself, and I, being born in 1980, I'm already poorer and with less chances than my parents. And this is the overall trend in the European Union, that today's 40 or 30 somethings, they are poorer and more deprived of many resources than their parents. This is the first generation, the lost generation. Then we will probably somehow, let's say, put this heritage also on our kids. But since our kids will face very different challenges, it is difficult to predict if this trend will be the case when my son, who's now 4, is, 24 or 34 or 44. Probably not, because they will fight their own, let's say, demons and their own problems, like environmental changes, like those deprivation of many resources. But at the same time, conquering the space. Maybe you can see that Elon Musk or this Richard Branson or some other people, they already fly to the space as tourists. We have already sort of explored the moon, and now we are exploring Mars. Who knows where it will lead, to in 30 years or 40 years. It may bring some kind of prosperity, in a sense that maybe it will bring a sense of happiness, not prosperity as wealth. Well, if we think about those challenges of tomorrow that, for example, Yuval Noah Harari described in his books, and all those theorists who differ from Fukuyama, for example, who stated that we will at some point achieve this wonderful democratic liberal order, and we will sort of swim in it in happiness and prosperity. This hasn't happened, well, yet at least. But I think that since those challenges will be that different, those that our kids will face, I also have a lot of hope that they will survive them and face them also with a little bit more certainty and a little bit more self-awareness, and probably also strengths that are in their heads rather than in their hands or legs. And honestly, I also believe in psychology and those developments here, science as such, because I think that people value more now something like happiness rather than wealth in this economic sense. There are people who have achieved a certain level on which, despite the fact that it's really far, far away from what Elon Musk has or Jeff Bezos, but at the same time who feel happy, satisfied. They have this sense of hygge, whatever the Danish type of happiness. Those indexes. Now I can see that, for example, we have been evaluating the level of democracy, and there are those democracy indexes and so on. But scientists, they look more and more towards indexes of happiness rather than of democracy, because democracy does not have to necessarily equal happiness. While the opposite direction, it also doesn't work that easily, because in Bhutan, for example, you don't have democracy, but people are happy. So maybe, this progress in psychology, maybe it will also bring some new, let's say, developments for our children. And maybe therefore they will be a little bit happier than we are. Maybe all those therapies, maybe, let's say, different types of raising children, maybe it will bring much more than just economic development, because we have probably been also this generation or generations, the post-war generations, that had those or lots of problems due to the way we were raised, like, with no fathers, or with fathers alcoholics, and, with all those problems that do not necessarily have to influence our kids' lives. And yeah, this is what I see with a lot of hope. But at the same time, speaking about politics, that's a very good question. Maybe direct democracy, which Estonia goes more and more towards, and it works. Maybe a little bit different forms of democracy with more involvement of the citizens, but at the same time with more, let's say, smaller groups that gather and decide politically. Maybe those mini publics that also decide about certain things. Maybe this can be also a good instrument of bringing democracy back, actually, to those populist-led states. Maybe, the generational change will also simply bring changes that we are not aware yet of. Like, maybe Kaczynski will give away his leadership to someone else, and this will bring, let's say, the end to law and justice. We don't know that. Of course, we can take this into consideration while predicting the future, but we are not sure about whether it will really strongly influence that or not. But at the same time, as I said, there are a lot of unpredicted factors. At the same time, there are a lot of developments, also scientific developments, that may change everything vastly and into a situation which we really cannot foresee now. Maybe situations like this pandemic, maybe there will be more of them. Who knows? And we will have to face them. And maybe this will also change our perception of what wealth is, what welfare is, what happiness is. We will see what consumerism is as well, because we are now consuming a lot, but maybe the future, and also those questions about the future of the earth, maybe they will also bring a different type of consumer behaviors. It's already happening. Maybe the chains of globalization will shorten due to such situations like the pandemic now, and maybe the EU will profit from that. It has already profited from that. I think that the USA really benefited from that a lot due to the pandemic, because a lot of companies came back to the USA. It can be similar in the European Union. So maybe this will also bring, let's say, a totally different picture of the future than we can even imagine now. So that's the toughest question, probably. But I do hope that the next generation will be healthier, happier, and wealthier than us. But the trend for the moment is the opposite. But I think that all those threats that they will challenge, probably they give paradoxically much more hope than let's say disillusion.
Well, Renata, just thank you for the brilliant analysis. It was absolutely
Thank you.
enjoyable. Many data, many new ideas to think about. And thank you very much for
Thank
finding
you.
time beyond your other duties to have this conversation. Thank you.